The tide was coming in, a slow, rhythmic pulse against the jagged rocks of Blackwood Cove, when I first saw her. It had been exactly 21 days since I'd stood in a rain-slicked cemetery and said goodbye to the woman who had been my entire world. Grief isn't a storm, it's a fog. It settles into your bones and makes every movement feel like you're treading through deep water. I wasn't on that beach looking for a miracle or a distraction. I was just trying to remember how to breathe. Without feeling like my lungs were filled with glass, she was standing where the foam licked the shore, a silhouette against the bruised purple of a dying sunset. She wasn't dressed for a casual stroll. She was wearing an emerald green swimsuit, a shade so vibrant it looked like a bruise on the pale gray landscape of my life. She stood with her chin tilted toward the horizon, her posture so rigid it was a challenge to the wind itself. She looked like a woman who had decided to be invincible because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. I wasn't staring at her curves or the way the silk clung to her skin. I was staring at her defiance. It was the first thing that had looked truly alive to me in weeks. When she sensed my presence, she didn't startle. She didn't adjust her straps or look away. She turned with a slow, agonizing grace, her gaze locking onto mine with the precision of a hawk. Her eyes were a storm-tossed hazel, sharp enough to draw blood. "My face is up here," she said. Her voice didn't carry the heat of anger. It carried a weary, practiced weight, the sound of a woman who had used that line as a shield against 1,000 men who only saw a silhouette instead of a person. I didn't blink. I didn't apologize. I simply looked into those tired, beautiful eyes and said the only thing that felt honest. "You chose that color because you wanted to be seen." The world seemed to stop. The roar of the Atlantic faded into a dull hum. Alone, Huron cut across the sky, its wings casting a long shadow over the sand. For a few seconds, she just stared at me, her defenses vibrating with the shock of being understood. Then something crumbled. Not a collapse, but a softening. Her lips didn't just curve. They gave way to a genuine, fragile smile that transformed her face from a mask of marble into something human. "Maybe I did," she whispered in that moment. I realized this wasn't just my neighbor from the cottage with the blue shutters. Her name was Evelyn. She had moved into her late aunt's place 6 months ago, trailing a reputation for being reclusive and cold. I knew she had a 7-year-old daughter named Sophie who spent her mornings digging for treasures in the tide. Pools. I knew she kept her lights on until 3 in the morning. What I hadn't known was that she was carrying a weight that mirrored my own. She wasn't looking for admiration. She was wearing that swimsuit like a suit of armor, trying to reclaim a body and a soul that someone else had tried to convince her was worthless. She wasn't looking for a savior. She was looking for a witness. That night, I sat on my deck with a glass of heavy amber bourbon, watching the moon rise over the water. The air was thick with the scent of wild jasmine and salt. I heard her sliding. Door creak. She stepped out onto her own porch, 15 feet away, wrapped in a thick, oversized wool sweater that swallowed her frame. She looked smaller now, less like a warrior and more like a woman trying to find her way back to herself. She held a mug of tea between both hands, the steam rising in the cool night air. She glanced toward me, then back at the waves, a silent hesitation hanging between us. I raised my glass in a quiet toast. No words, just an acknowledgement. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then raised her mug in return. We sat there in the shared silence of two people who had forgotten how to exist. In the light, the next morning, the silence was broken by a high-pitched, frantic voice. Sir, you have to see." I was walking the shoreline with my coffee when Sophie came sprinting toward me, her hair a wild tangle of blonde curls and her knees caked in wet sand. She was cupping her hands together like she was holding a flickering flame. "Look," she gasped, sliding to a halt in front of me. She opened her palms to reveal a piece of cobalt blue sea glass, perfectly frosted and smooth. It was the color of a deep summer sky. "It's a blue tear," she said, her eyes wide with wonder. "The ocean cried it just for me." I knelt in the sand, ignoring the dampness seeping into my jeans. "That's a rare find, Sophie," I said softly. "Do you know how it gets that way?" She shook her head. "It starts out as a broken bottle. Sharp, jagged, and dangerous. But the ocean takes it and tosses it against the rocks for years. It breaks it down, rolls it through the sand, and survives the biggest storms. And when it finally comes back to the shore, it isn't sharp anymore. It's beautiful because of what it went through." Sophie stared at the glass, then looked at me with a wisdom that children shouldn't have to possess. "So it's not broken anymore?" she asked. "No," I replied. "It's just different, stronger." She beamed, her smile bright enough to rival the morning sun, and ran back toward the cottage, shouting for her mother. Evelyn was standing on the edge of the grass, her arms wrapped tightly around her waist. She had been watching us. Our eyes met across the distance, and for the first time, I didn't see a wall. I saw an opening. I lifted my coffee cup in a silent greeting. She didn't wave, but she didn't retreat. She stayed there, letting the sun hit her face, watching her daughter play. Over the following weeks, a rhythm developed. It was a slow dance of proximity. We shared coffee on the porch steps. I learned that she liked her brew black and bitter, a reflection of the years she'd spent trying to stay awake through the nightmares of her past. I learned that she tucked her hair behind her left ear when she was nervous, and that she could identify every shell on the beach by its Latin name. She learned that I was a man of few words, a man who found peace in the grain of a piece of oak and the steady beat of the tide. I told her about Sarah, about the way she used to burn the edges of every grilled cheese sandwich, and how she'd sing off-key to the radio just to make me laugh. "She sounds like she was sunshine," Evelyn said one evening as we watched the heat lightning dance on the horizon. "She was," I said, the ache in my chest feeling a little less like a puncture wound and more like a scar. "She made me promise I wouldn't turn into a ghost. She told me to find a reason to feel the sun again." Evelyn was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the rhythmic crickets in the tall grass. My ex-husband, didn't like the sun," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He told me I was too loud, too much, too bright. He spent 10 years trying to dim my lights. He told me I was lucky he was willing to stay with someone as damaged as me. By the time I left, I didn't even recognize the woman in the mirror. That day on the beach, in that green suit, that was me trying to see if there was anything left of the girl I used to be." "There is," I said, reaching across the small gap between our chairs to rest my hand near hers. I didn't touch her, not yet. I just let the warmth of my hand offer a choice. "There's more than enough left." She didn't pull away. Instead, she slid her fingers against mine, a tentative, trembling connection. It wasn't a grand, romantic gesture. It was two survivors reaching for a lifeline in the middle of a vast, dark ocean. A few days later, the peace of the cove was shattered. I was in my workshop, the scent of cedar shavings thick in the air, when I heard the unmistakable roar of an engine that didn't belong in our quiet neighborhood. A silver, late-model European sedan pulled into Evelyn's gravel drive, kicking up a cloud of dust. A man stepped out, dressed in a suit that was too sharp for the salt air. His hair perfectly coiffed, his smile as bright and artificial as a fluorescent bulb. Evelyn was on her porch, and I saw the moment she recognized him. Her entire body went rigid. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost. This was Julian, the man who had spent a decade convincing her she was nothing. He walked toward her with an easy, arrogant confidence, as if he still held the keys to her soul. "Evelyn," he called out, his voice smooth and dripping with a condescending warmth. You're looking rugged. This little seaside retreat has certainly changed you. She didn't move. She looked like she was rooted to the floorboards. What do you want, Julian? I wanted to see my family, he said, spreading his arms wide. I've been doing a lot of soul searching, Evie. I realize I was hard on you. But I've changed. I've been seeing a therapist. I want to bring you and Sophie home. This isn't a life for a woman like you. Living in a drafty old shack, you deserve the best. You deserve me. I stepped out of my workshop, my hands still dusted with wood shavings. I didn't say a word. I just walked toward the edge of her property and stood there, a silent sentinel. Julian's eyes flicked to me, a momentary flash of annoyance crossing his polished features before the mask of charm slid back into place. And who are you? The local handyman? He's my friend, Evelyn said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. Julian laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. A friend? Come now, Evelyn. We both know you can't survive on your own. You've always needed someone to tell you which way is up. Don't let this friendship cloud your judgment. I'm offering you everything back. The house, the club, the security. He stepped closer, reaching out to touch her arm. Evelyn flinched, pulling back as if his hand were a hot iron. At that moment, the screen door flew open and Sophie ran out. She saw her father and froze. There was no joy in her expression. Number. Daddy's home excitement. There was only a cold, paralyzing fear. She looked at Julian, then her eyes darted to me. Without a second thought, she sprinted down the stairs and hid behind my legs, clutching my jeans with trembling hands. Sophie, darling, come to Daddy, Julian said, his voice tightening with repressed anger. No, Sophie whispered against my leg. I want to stay with Mr. Elias. He shows me the sea glass. The mask finally cracked. Julian's face contorted into something jagged and cruel. You've poisoned her, he spat, looking at Evelyn. You filled her head with nonsense and turned her against me. I have lawyers, Evelyn. I have resources you can't even imagine. If you don't come back, I'll make sure you never see her again. I'll prove you're unstable. Look at you, living like a hermit in the middle of nowhere. I felt the heat of protective rage boiling in my blood, but I kept my voice low and steady. The only person who looks unstable here is the man threatening. A mother in front of her child, I said. You should get in your car and leave, now. Julian sneered at me, stepping into my personal space. Or what? You'll hit me with a piece of wood? You're nothing but a distraction. A temporary fix for a broken woman. Evelyn stepped off the porch then. She walked right up to him, her eyes burning with a fire I hadn't seen before. She wasn't the woman in the green swimsuit anymore. She was the woman who had survived the storm. I am not broken, Julian, she said, her voice ringing out across the cove. I was just being reshaped. And I'm not a woman who needs you to tell her which way is up. I know exactly where I am. I'm home, and you? You're a ghost. Now, get off my property before I call the sheriff and show him the restraining order I've had since the day I left you. Julian stared at her, the realization sinking in that he no longer held the leash. He looked at me, then at Sophie, who was still tucked safely behind me. With a muttered curse, he turned on his heel and stormed back to his car. The gravel screamed under his tires as he sped away, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust and the fading echo of his arrogance. The silence that followed was heavy. Evelyn stood in the driveway, her chest heaving, her hands shaking uncontrollably. I walked over to her, Sophie still trailing at my side. I didn't say anything. I just opened my arms. She fell into them, her forehead resting against my chest, and she finally let go. She cried for the years she'd lost, for the fear she'd carried, and for the sheer, overwhelming relief of being free. I held her, my chin resting on the top of her head, while Sophie hugged both of our legs. We stood there as the sun began its descent, three people who had been tossed by the ocean and finally found a shore that didn't want to break them, but healing isn't a straight line. The next 2 weeks were hard. The confrontation with Julian had triggered all of Evelyn's old anxieties. She withdrew again, the curtains of her cottage staying drawn for days at a time. She was terrified that he would follow through on his threats, that his money and influence would take Sophie away. I wanted to help, but I knew what it felt like to want to hide from the world. I remembered the weeks after Sarah died when the sound of the doorbell felt like a physical assault. I followed the advice of my other neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a woman who had lived in the Cove for 70 years and buried 2 husbands of her own. "Don't try to pull her out of the dark," she told me while handing me a tin of her famous lemon squares. "Just sit in the dark with her until she's ready to see the light. Show her that you aren't going to run just because things got messy." So I did. I didn't knock on her door and demand she talk. I didn't send frantic texts. Instead, I simply showed up. Every morning, I left a fresh cup of coffee and a small piece of sea glass on her porch railing. Every afternoon, I'd sit on my own porch and work on a small wooden dollhouse I was building for Sophie. The sound of my sandpaper, a steady, reassuring presence. I was showing her that I was a constant. I was the type predictable, enduring, and always there. On the 10th day, the door finally opened. Evelyn stepped out, her hair a mess and her eyes tired. But she was wearing the wool sweater I'd seen her in that first night. She sat down on the steps and picked up the coffee I'd left. "I'm sorry," she said as I walked over to join her. "I'm not very good at this, the letting people in part." "You don't have to be good at it," I said, sitting a respectful distance away. "You just have to be here." She leaned her head back against the porch post. "He's suing for full custody. He filed the paperwork yesterday." I felt a cold chill, but I didn't let it show. "Then we fight," I said. "I have a friend in the city, a family law attorney who specializes in cases like this. He doesn't care about money. He cares about what's right. We aren't going to let him take her, Evelyn." She looked at me, her eyes searching mine for any hint of doubt. "Why are you doing this, Elias? Why are you taking on my mess?" "Because you're in a mess," I said, finally reaching out and taking her hand. This time my grip was firm. "You're a woman who survived a shipwreck, and I'm a man who spent too long drifting in the middle of the ocean. Maybe we found this cove for a reason. I'm not leaving, Evelyn. Not now, not when the lawyers show up, not ever." The legal battle was long and grueling. Julian tried every dirty trick in the book. He hired private investigators to tail us. He tried to use my grief against me, suggesting I was an unstable influence on Sophie. But he underestimated the community of Blackwood Cove. Mrs. Gable testified about the polished man she saw threatening a mother. The local school teacher spoke about Sophie's transformation from a shy, anxious child into a girl who laughed and searched for sea glass, and Evelyn thought Evelyn was a revelation. In that courtroom, she didn't look like a victim. She looked like a queen. She spoke with a clarity and a strength that left Julian's expensive lawyers stuttering in the end. The judge saw Julian for exactly what he was, a man who wanted control, not a daughter. Evelyn was granted sole custody, and the permanent restraining order was put in place. The day we walked out of that courthouse, the air felt different. It was crisp, clean, and full of possibility. 6 months later, the cove was alive with the sights and sounds of spring. The jasmine was in full bloom, and the water was a shimmering turquoise. I was in my workshop, finishing the roof on Sophie's dollhouse, when I heard a familiar laugh. I looked out the window to see Evelyn and Sophie running along the shore. Evelyn was wearing that emerald green swimsuit again. But this time, she wasn't wearing it as armor. She was wearing it because she loved the way the sun felt on her skin. She wasn't daring the world to look. She was simply existing in it, vibrant and whole. She saw me watching and stopped, a wide, unencumbered smile spreading across her face. She didn't say, "Eyes are up here." Instead, she waved me down to the water dot. I walked toward them, the sand warm between my toes. Sophie ran up to me, holding a jar filled with the treasures we'd found over the months. "Look, Elias, I found a red one, a red tear." I looked at the rare piece of sea glass, then at Evelyn, who had come to stand beside me. I pulled her close, her shoulder fitting perfectly under my arm. We stood there together, three people who had been broken, tossed, and refined by the storms of life. I thought back to that first day on the beach, to the widower who thought his heart was buried in a cemetery, and the woman who thought she was invisible. We were like the sea glass weathered by the waves, shaped by the rocks, and polished by the very things that tried to destroy us. We weren't the same people we had been before the tragedies hit, but we were something better. We were resilient. We were together. And for the first time in a very long time, the future didn't look like a fog. It looked like the sun rising over an endless, beautiful horizon. Sometimes, life breaks you just so it can put you back together in a way that's more beautiful than the original. It takes courage to stand in the surf when the tide is high. It takes even more courage to let someone stand there with you. I want to leave you with a thought. Is there a part of yourself you've been hiding because you think it's too broken to be seen? Are you wearing armor because you're afraid of the light? I'm telling you now, your story isn't over. The ocean might be rough and the rocks might be sharp, but there is a shore waiting for you. There's someone out there who won't just look at you, but will truly see you. If this journey through the salt air and the shadows touched something in you today, if it reminded you that healing is possible even when the world feels gray, then I'm glad you were here. We tell these stories because we all need to know we aren't alone in the dark. We need to know that the blue tears we cry can turn into something precious. Make sure you stay connected with us. Every story we share is a reminder of the strength of the human spirit and the power of second chances. Your presence here matters, and your own story has chapters yet to be written. Until we meet again on this shore, keep looking for the sea glass in your own life. Keep choosing to be seen. I'll be here, ready to share the next journey with you. See you very soon.